What would you do if your state needed a Capitol building and had no money to pay for it? On November 9th, 1881, the Texas Capitol burned to the ground. Texas was land-rich and cash-poor, so it paid with dirt 3 million acres of Panhandle grass handed to Chicago investors in exchange for a building. What went up on that land became the largest fenced cattle ranch in the world, running 150,000 head across 10 counties. Within 80 years, every single acre was sold off, and the men who took 3 million free acres never made a profit on them. Let me start with the survey party, because somebody had to go look at what Texas was giving away. In March 1882, a man named Amos Babcock rode out into the western Texas Panhandle with a surveyor, several local cowboys, and a Mexican cook. His job was to inspect the land his investment group was about to accept as payment. It took 36 days. They covered more than 950 miles north to south and east to west, mapping ground that ran better than 220 miles along the New Mexico border. Now picture what that actually meant in 1882. No railroad, no towns, no fences. This was the Llano Estacado, the staked plains, flat, treeless, high country where you could ride all day and see nothing change. It had been the territory of the Querecho and Tayas peoples, and more recently the Comanche, whose removal from the southern plains had only just been forced through. The land was empty because it had been emptied, and it had almost no reliable surface water. That's the detail that should have stopped everything. You cannot run cattle on grass they can't reach because they'll die of thirst standing in feed. Babcock came back to Chicago anyway and told the investors the opposite of caution. Fence it immediately, he said, stock it with longhorns out of Central and South Texas and put up windmills. Understand what he was recommending, not buy the land and hold it. He was telling men who had never ranched to build the largest fenced enclosure anyone had attempted, on ground, with no water, no rail access, and no infrastructure of any kind. And I want you to hold on to the water problem, because it comes back at the end of this story in a form nobody in 1882 could have predicted. Why would Texas hand that over in the first place? Because the state had backed itself into a corner. Back in 1879, the 16th Texas legislature had set aside 3 million acres of unsettled panhandle land specifically to finance a new Capitol building. It appointed a Capitol board, the governor, the comptroller, the treasurer, the attorney general, and the land commissioner to find a buyer and a contractor. Texas owned an enormous amount of land and had very little liquid capital. That's not a metaphor. That was the balance sheet. Public land was the only asset large enough to cover a project that size. And there's a reason land was the currency rather than bonds or taxes. Texas had entered the Union, keeping its public lands, unlike most states, where that acreage went to the federal government. So Texas held an asset almost no other state had, millions of acres it could spend directly. The 1875 Constitution had already set the framework for putting some of it toward public buildings. What the state lacked wasn't wealth, it was cash. Then the old Capitol burned on November 9th, 1881, and a slow bureaucratic land sale turned into an emergency. Governor Oren Roberts called a special legislative session. What had been a plan became a transaction that had to close. The first man to take the contract was Matthias Schnell of Rock Island, Illinois, early in 1882. He didn't keep it long. Schnell transferred 3/4 of his interest to Taylor, Babcock, and Company of Chicago, which organized what became known as the Capitol Syndicate. Charles B. Farwell, John V. Farwell, Colonel Amos C. Babcock, and Colonel Abner Taylor. Several months later, Schnell assigned the rest of the contract to them as well, after rumors surfaced that he had bribed one of the Capitol commissioners and had tried to bribe the building's architect, Elijah E. Myers. So the arrangement that produced this ranch nearly began in a bribery scandal, and the men who ended up with 3 million acres got there partly because the original contractor's reputation collapsed. And notice what that scandal reveals about the deal itself. This was one of the largest transfers of public property in American history, negotiated in a hurry under political pressure by a board of elected officials with no comparable transaction to reference. Nobody knew what 3 million acres of Panhandle grass was worth, because nothing that size had ever changed hands there. The price was essentially invented. Now the Farwells had a problem they don't usually get credit for. They owed Texas a building, and the land wasn't payment until the building existed. The capital had been estimated at around $1.5 million. It came in at $3,744,630.60. The syndicate paid $3,224,593.45 of that, and the state absorbed more than $500,000. Think about the position that puts you in. You've agreed to construct one of the largest buildings in the country in Austin using granite that has to be hauled from quarries in Burnett County, which required building a railroad just to move the stone. You're short of skilled masons, so you bring granite men over from Scotland, and the asset you're being paid with is 3 million acres of grass that generates nothing until it's fenced, watered, and stocked, which costs money you don't have either. So John V. Farwell got on a ship. In late 1984, he sailed to England and formed the Capital Freehold Land and Investment Company Limited in London. The company sold debentures paying 5%. Among the British backers were the Earl of Aberdeen and Henry Seton Kerr, a member of Parliament. How much he raised depends on which account you read. One puts the target at $15 million, with about 10 million actually raised. Another says roughly 5 million was raised to keep the ranch running. The figures conflict, so treat the exact number as uncertain, but the mechanism is not in doubt. And that mechanism is the thing most people get wrong about this place. The XIT was never a Texas cattle empire in the sense that the King Ranch or the Wagoner were. It was a British-financed land company run from Chicago that used cattle to service debt while it waited to subdivide and sell. That distinction matters for everything that follows. A family ranch can lose money for 5 years and survive on stubbornness because the only person it answers to is the family. A company that has sold interest-bearing debentures to investors in London answers to those investors on a schedule. Every dry year, every price dip, every dead cow is a step toward a conversation with bondholders who are owed 5%, whether it rained or not, which brings us to what they actually built. The first cattle arrived in 1885, around 22,000 head trailed up from Fort Concho, longhorns pushed north to a division headquarters at Buffalo Springs, better than 30 miles north of what is now Dalhart. The brand came from a trail driver named Ab Blocker. There's a persistent story that XIT stands for 10 in Texas, for the 10 counties the ranch touched. It's a good story, and it's probably not true. Blocker's reasoning, as it comes down to us, was practical. The mark could be burned with a straight iron in 3 strokes, and it was very hard for a rustler to alter into something else. Cattle theft was a real operating cost, not a movie plot, and a brand's job was to be unforgeable. Then they fenced it, roughly 1,500 miles of barbed wire went up across the property, with about 575 miles of that forming the outside boundary alone. The cedar post and wire came to around $181,000, and they went after the water problem directly. Something on the order of $500,000 went into roughly 100 dams and 325 windmills. That's the part I find genuinely impressive, and it's worth being concrete about why. A windmill on the Llano Estacado is not decoration. It's a machine that lifts water out of the ground using nothing but wind, which means an animal can drink in country where no stream exists. Every windmill converted a patch of unusable grass into usable pasture. The fences then let managers control which pasture got grazed and when, instead of letting cattle hammer the same ground until it died. 325 of those, plus 100 dams, is how you make 3 million dry acres hold 150,000 cattle. At its peak, the ranch ran about 150,000 head with roughly 150 hands and 600 horses. It was organized into divisions: Buffalo Springs, Middle Water, Ojo Bravo, Alamositas, Rita Blanca, Escarbada, Spring Lake, Yellow Houses, with headquarters at Channing. Accounts differ on whether there were 7 or 8 at a given time, which tells you something about how much the structure moved around. And it took a workforce to run. The XIT employed as many as 150 cowboys at peak, spread across divisions that could be a hard day's ride apart. A single fence line of 575 miles doesn't inspect itself. Riders worked the wire continuously because one broken strand in country with no natural barriers meant cattle walking into New Mexico. Windmills needed maintenance, leathers, gears, sucker rods, and a mill that stops in July means dead animals within days. That's the operating reality behind the big number. 3 million acres isn't a possession. It's a maintenance obligation that never stops. The whole thing worked. Then the market broke. In 1885 and 1886, beef prices collapsed, and the XIT, sitting on the most land of anyone in the business, discovered that scale is not the same thing as strength. When prices fall, the operation with 150,000 cattle to move is more exposed than the operation with 500, because every animal costs money to hold and there's nowhere to sell it. Here's where the company's real nature shows. The syndicate leaned on its foreign investors for capital to get through. A family ranch in that situation sells cows. A leveraged land company in that situation borrows more. There's a human layer to this that I think gets overlooked. The XIT ran on rules. In 1885, management issued a written code of conduct for employees: no gambling, no liquor on the property, restrictions on carrying firearms, prohibitions on the sort of behavior that was standard on other outfits. This was a corporate personnel policy applied to 19th century Panhandle cowboys, written by men in Chicago and London who had likely never worked cattle. You can see the friction in what happened next. When Albert G. Boyce took over as manager in 1888, he fired and replaced most of the ranch's 150 cowboys. And Boyce is the turn in this story because he was the first person running the place who actually knew the business. J. Evetts Haley, whose 1929 history remains the standard account, described him as a frontier cowman of commanding presence and vast experience. Boyce divided the ranch into divisions with separate functions and built himself a house at Channing. Around the same time, John Farwell moved to replace the ranch's longhorn herds with Hereford, Durham, and Angus stock, cattle bred to put on weight rather than walk distances, which is what a market served by rail actually wanted. The results were real. In August 1891, according to the Fort Worth Daily Gazette, the first trainload of beeves left Farwell Park in Channing for Chicago, with plans to ship another 200 cars later that month. They also leased grass in Montana and the Dakotas to finish cattle in cooler country before sale. So, better cattle, better management, rail shipping, northern grass. The operation was as good as it was going to get. And here's the reversal. The XIT is not known to have ever shown a profit. Read that again, because it inverts the entire assumption behind this story. Everyone hears 3 million free acres and pictures a fortune. What actually happened is that the men who received the largest single land grant in Texas history spent a quarter century failing to make money on it. Meanwhile, look at what Texas got. The state ended up receiving something in the neighborhood of $1.07 an acre for that land, once you account for the construction cost. At the time, watered land in Texas was selling for around 55 cents an acre, and unwatered land for about 25. The state got roughly double the going rate in the form of a granite building that still stands. The investors got grass that ate their capital. The people who supposedly took Texas to the cleaners lost the trade. And this is where I think the lesson of the XIT genuinely differs from every other ranch story in Texas. The King Ranch and the Wagoner and the 4-6s all had one thing. The XIT never did. Owners who lived on the ground and intended to die there. The XIT had shareholders in 2 countries who wanted a return. Cattle were the interim use of an asset, not the point of it. And an operation run as an interim use tends to get managed for the exit rather than for the next 50 years. There's a physical cost too, and it's the kind that doesn't show up in a ledger for decades. Running that many animals in peak years degraded the range. Grass cover thinned and productivity fell with it. On the Llano Estacado, where rainfall is marginal in the best years, overgrazing isn't a temporary problem. It changes what the ground can carry. So the herd came down from its peak as sales and losses mounted, and the pressure from London got worse. By the late 1890s, the British creditors wanted out. Bondholders who had bought debentures on the promise of a 5% return were looking at an operation that had never turned a profit, and they began demanding redemption, which forced the syndicate to do the thing it had always intended to do eventually, just sooner and under pressure. Land sales began in 1901. And the arithmetic of that sale is the reason the ranch was always going to end. Farmland sold in small parcels is worth far more per acre than grazing land sold whole, because a farmer buying 320 acres to feed a family will pay more for each one than a rancher buying 50,000 to run cattle. Every year, the Panhandle got more rail, more windmills, and more settlers. The gap widened. The cattle operation wasn't competing with other ranches. It was competing with the value of its own dirt sold to somebody else. That's what killed the largest fenced ranch in the world. Not drought, not rustlers, not the winters. Real estate. I want to be fair to the Farwells here because the subdivision wasn't a failure of nerve. From the outset, the long-range plan had been to run cattle only until the country could support agriculture, then break the ranch up and sell it off. John V. Farwell in particular had ideas about Texas as a destination for immigrants who could settle on the XIT. The problem was the timing. They were now selling to satisfy creditors rather than to capture value. Most of the bonds were redeemed by 1909 to the satisfaction of the English investors. The investment company ceased to exist, with final accounts settled and dissolution completed in 1915. The remaining interest went to the Farwell heirs, who organized it as a trust called Capital Reservation Lands. The cattle went first. On November 1st, 1912, the last XIT cattle were sold, 13,560 head. That's the end of the ranch as a working operation 27 years after the first Longhorns arrived. And here's the small detail that lands it for me. R.L. Duke, who had been foreman of the Buffalo Springs Division and later assistant general manager, was kept on to oversee the range that was leased out afterward, which made him, by most accounts, the last XIT cowboy actually working for the estate. One man still riding for a brand whose cattle had all been sold. The land took another 50 years. By 1929, roughly 450,000 acres remained in X1T ownership. By 1943, that was down to around 350,000. Large parcels went to other ranchers, small acreages went to farmers. The last of the XIT lands were sold in 1963, ending nearly 80 years of capital syndicate ownership. And this is where the story stops being about a ranch and becomes about a region. The breakup created the map. Towns exist along the old ranch edges because the ranch was dismantled. Dalhart, Channing, Texline, Bovina, and two separate places named Farwell for the brothers. The families that bought those parcels are the reason there's a farming economy in that part of the Panhandle at all. That's the honest trade-off, and it cuts both ways. 3 million acres in one company's hands became thousands of acres in many hands, which is a better outcome by most measures. But the row crop farming that replaced the cattle depends heavily on groundwater pumped from the Ogallala aquifer, and that aquifer is declining across the southern high plains. The land was rescued from one kind of overuse and handed to another. There's also the plainest fact in the whole story, which nobody in 1882 treated as a cost. Texas gave away 3 million acres of land it had taken from the peoples who lived there in exchange for a building. The state never got the land back and was never going to. So come back to that burned capital. The replacement opened to the public on San Jacinto Day, April 1888. It is still the largest state capitol building in the country, and you can walk into it today. Texas paid for it with land, and the payment worked exactly as designed. The ranch that was the payment is gone. What's left is scattered: the corrals, foreman's residence, and bunkhouse at Buffalo Springs, which still stand as the oldest structures in Dallam County. A museum in Dalhart, an annual reunion and rodeo that began in Fort Worth in 1936 and settled permanently in Dalhart, held for decades by men who had worked the place and then their descendants. And one more thing which happened in 2022. A man named Drew Knowles bought the 11,520-acre Burson Rita Blanca Creek Ranch in the Panhandle, a property that had been the XIT's old mare pasture. Knowles is the great-great-great-grandson of John V. Farwell. 6 generations after his ancestor traded a building for a kingdom and lost money on it, a piece of it came back into the family. Here's the question I keep turning over. Texas traded 3 million acres for one building, and by any financial measure, the state came out ahead. It got double the market rate and a monument that has outlasted everyone involved. But only one side of that trade still exists. The capital is standing. The ranch is a brand on a museum wall and a name on a rodeo. Which one was the asset?